the politics, if we put it kindly, has been a bit volatile, like our markets at the moment, in terms of returns, not so much in terms of listings and so on. But it just doesn't seem to be enough.
Thanks. I think for us to understand where we are, at least from my perspective, we have to take a step back.
First of all, you say the pace is too slow. Get that. Does the government realize that? Because you don't hear them always verbalize it.
Yes, they do realize in the budget. It puts 1 trillion rand worth of capital for infrastructure investment.
Ladies and gentlemen, good day and welcome to another special episode of Power Plays and Paydays here on EBNet Stream. Today, my special guest is Isaah Mhlanga, who is the Chief Economist and Head of Global Research at Rand Merchant Bank, or RMB. And if I'm correct, Isaah, you're also a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Committee. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, well, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us, and for everyone's information, Isaah and I are ex-colleagues, so I'm delighted to be reconnecting with them today on this podcast. So, Isaah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that invitation, Leon. Great to catch up after a couple of years.
Couple of years indeed. And I was just saying to Isaah, he doesn't have a single grey hair, so I'm feeling quite envious of him at this point. I'm a little bit upset about that. But anyway, so Isaah, this podcast is called Power Plays and Paydays. And we put it together because our audience is predominantly retirement funds, financial advisors, investment consultants, EB consultants, the trustees, Manco members for umbrella funds, and so on. So you can't really just look at economics without considering the policy that leads into the economics, which is ultimately the politics. And South Africa has obviously been through much change over the last 30 years. And I suppose the politics, if we put it kindly, has been a bit volatile, like our markets at the moment. There's been some good, some bad along the way. And right now, there are a few challenging questions that are coming to the fore. And you can see that in the polling numbers. So we often look at the polling numbers done by the Social Research Foundation to see what is the population thinking at this point. And I suppose it's been quite one-directional over the last couple of years as the ANC has lost its grip on power, as it had to start sharing power, and that direction seems to be continuing in that regard. And if I'm right in terms of interpreting the voter, it's because they want to see delivery. They want to see jobs. They want to see economic growth ultimately coming through. Now, if I go back to the budget just over a month ago, it was a positive budget. We all sort of listened and came away feeling good about what was spoken about. But there was a little bit of discomfort with me. I felt it was a little bit insufficient, if I could put it that way. It was positive, but not enough. So I was taught early on in my career that when investing, you need to look at your time horizon, because investing in cash, which is the riskless investment or relatively riskless, could indeed be the riskiest investment because it won't give you sufficient return in order to meet your liability. Is it not a similar situation that we're sitting with in South Africa? Yes, we're seeing some growth come to the fore. There's been positive news around the likes of the grey listing and other upgrades and so on. JSE, up until more recent times, was booming in terms of returns, not so much in terms of listings and so on. But it just doesn't seem to be enough, because if I listen to some of the commentators, we need fixed investment to be multiples of the levels that they're at now, and the current efforts aren't going to get us there. So let me stop there and ask you to please comment on all of that. How do you see it? Do you think it's enough? Is it part of a process of development to get to the levels we need to ultimately get to?
Thanks. I think for us to understand where we are, at least from my perspective, we have to take a step back and look since 1994, how have the country tried to put together its own economic policy and institutions that underlie confidence for investment. So the period from 94 to 99 really was reintegrating into the global economy. And then thereafter, we had a period of building institutions that underpinned quite a decent level of economic growth up to 2008 or so. And then we lost the plot a little bit after that. The sort of policies that we adopted were anti-private sector in a way. They advocated for a bigger state, the state running a lot more in terms of the critical sectors of the economy. And then, a lot of corruption that we now know that have been ventilated through, various commissions, some of which are still taking place today, that's still uncovering what happened during that period. And the resulting effect was, credit rating downgrades to junk status, debt levels that continued to rise. But if you look at how did we use that debt, it went straight into consumption and not financing fixed investment that can then underlie, faster economic growth going forward. And then we had in 2018 or so, a new administration comes in. We start to see some change in terms of economic policy direction, where there is openness to partner with the private sector to grow the economy, to solve some of the issues. But as I learned in my high school physics, something that they call momentum. Momentum is quite difficult to reverse. Almost if you think about a truck that is moving at 120 kilometers per hour, you hit a dead brick, it doesn't stop immediately. It's still going to go for some time until it stops. That's the same with the economy in a way. We have been on a negative trajectory. We get a change in administration that is open to the private sector. The effects of the previous decade before that does not stop immediately. They are still in society, they're still in government, they're still in the private sector. So you continue to see some deterioration. And then over the last 3 years or so, we start to see a significant shift in the reforms that have been taken in the energy sector. The private sector is now playing a big part there. Now we are also on the logistics sector. We're starting to see evidence that the private sector is also coming back to play a big part. There are also, reforms that are taking place at the metro level, municipal level, that should lay the ground for better collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. So we are now in a different environment. Yes, to your point, if you look at the growth numbers, they're still quite disappointing. We are not anywhere close to where we need to be to actually change the unemployment trajectory. Unemployment still remain quite high. Youth unemployment is even worse, which means that is what society is reflecting in the polling data that you alluded to. It's the issues of unemployment, it's the issues of crime, it's the issue of infrastructure degradation that makes the delivery of services to society to be poor quality than where it should be or where it has been before. That's what's being reflected. But in terms of the trajectory, we are moving in the right direction. The pace is slow, which in a way, if we obviously we would want the pace to be very fast. But if you look in many democratic countries where ideas are contested, it's not so easy to change things. You have to carry the country along the journey. Only in countries where you have benevolent dictators or dictatorships, or in the US where the power of the pen can sign an executive order and things change tomorrow, where you get a change. In our setup, that is not an avenue that we have. We have to persuade each other to move in a particular direction. But I would say this, what we have seen so far in terms of reforms in energy and what's being done in logistics and what's coming in the water sector, those are irreversible policy changes that should underlie better collaboration between the private sector and public sector going forward. So I'm a lot more confident in terms of the direction, even though I'm admitting or accepting that the pace is too slow to what we need to see.
So can I test with you two things quickly? So first of all, you say the pace is too slow. Get that. Does the government realize that? Because you don't hear them always verbalize it. You hear them talk about, we're going to achieve 1.5% growth, half 5, but the reality is we need 3 to 5% kind of thing. So I'm assuming they realize that.
Yes, they do realize. First, the opening up of these sectors to the private sector is a big realization that government cannot run these sectors alone. And in fact, they have not been able to run these sectors successfully. If you just think about energy and the load shedding that we had, you think about water and the water issues that we have in the country, you think about safety and security, crime, all of those things, government cannot do it alone. So the turnaround to say we are opening up to collaborating with the private sector, that's realization number one. The second one is, if you look at the budget, it puts 1 trillion rand worth of capital for infrastructure investment. So it's no longer just talk about reforms, it's actually putting budget behind the reforms to say we want to do these things. And if you think about if you look at the sectors that are being targeted, it's to a large extent 3 sectors. It's energy, logistics, and water. They take a significant share of that 1 trillion allocation for the next 3 years. So again, that's realization number 2 to say, yes, we can do the reform, but if we don't put capital behind it, those reforms are not going to actually materialize. And then you just look at how we have seen public sector and private sector collaborate, and we learned a lot from the COVID year, where the private sector was a big contributor in how we responded to COVID. Those lessons were then used into some of the reforms that are taking place. You have all the B4SA that are that business organization that works together in government. You have private sector deploying its own skills to the public sector without charge. And that shows, one, from the private sector, there's willingness to assist government. 2, on the government side, there's also acceptance that the capacity in government is quite limited now. And therefore, it's prudent to also get private sector skills that can help to fast track some of these reforms.
So that's good to hear all of that. And I want to ask you a question from a layman's perspective. So as a guy that lives in a house and, when the lights aren't on, is burning candles and doing whatever else, suddenly load shedding ended. And it was a case of, how did that suddenly happen? All right. And the perception, perhaps skeptically, is that we're just burning diesel the whole time in order to do that. And at some point in time, there's going to be more maintenance issues and so on. I'm saying that's a skeptical view in terms of it. So correct me. What in fact has happened that gives us, call it, sustainability over the power supply? And then linked to that, in the budget speech, they spoke about South Africa becoming a data center hub at some point in time. And I found that interesting because data centers are so energy intensive. So are we geared, in fact, to be able to be that?
So on the first, in terms of what happened for us to see load shedding end, that has been a good thing for the economy. It's multifaceted. There is the management of Eskom. There is the reforms in the energy sector, which has then enabled the private sector to come in. Let's maybe start with the management. For one to run an entity of the complexity of Eskom and the size of Eskom, there is need for leaders that can inspire the workers on a day-to-day, that do the day-to-day job, but also leaders that have the capability to look at the core issues and address them with the political capital, but also with the social capital to lead. That's what we saw with the current leadership. They have all those elements. So they could address the issues that have to do with the morale of the staff, the corruption in the entity, which they continue to address. Then the second part, which would be the reforms. Remember, we had a limit of 1 megawatt. Above that, you have to go and find a license, and there's so many approvals that you need. That limit have been removed. So that's a deliberate reform that was done to say, you are a private sector player, you want to build own power for your own consumption. You don't need a license. You just need to be able to register so that it's known. But you don't need all this, burdensome licensing processing that we used to have. And then we also saw households. They invested significantly in solar panels alongside the corporate sector that invested in solar panels. I mean, if you just look outside the roof here, you will see a lot of solar panels on top of buildings. That meant the demand for electricity from Eskom's production has declined, which means Eskom can then now have the capacity or the time to actually service and maintain the power stations without the significant demand that we used to have. And then there is a third element, which I think this one is still there in the background. The economy has been growing at 0.5, 1%, 1.1% last year. That's too slow economic growth. And what that it says is capacity utilization by big industries is quite low. It's not at full capacity, which means they're simply not demanding as much electricity usage because they are not, running their factories at full capacity. So that is something that we have to keep on the background. If the economy were to suddenly accelerate to 3%, and this capacity utilization from big industries increase to 80, 90%, we might actually get into a problem where we have insufficient power. So that is a function of how fast the economy is growing and how, at what level our big industries are utilizing their capacity. And that's still a risk that we need to watch.
EBNet is proud to bring you top quality content from experts across the financial services industry in South Africa and internationally for free. Your support helps us in doing this. All we ask is that you subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button below, share this video with others you think will benefit from it, and give us a thumbs up if you are enjoying the content. That way you help us help you. Thank you from the team at EBNet. For more great content, please visit www.ebnet.co.za.
But that's then straight to the question of, can we build data centers and become that data hub across Africa, given exactly that balance that we need to find between energy supply and demand?
So I'll respond to that question perhaps in an unusual way, to say that which a country wants to do and puts a lot of resources to, it can always do. It's not a matter of the constraints that we have now. Yes, at the current environment, we don't have sufficient electricity to be a data hub, given how much electricity they use. But we have seen other countries that plan long-term and dedicate resources, capital and human, or financial and human capital, to actually do the things they want to do. I will just mention one in Nigeria, in the building of the oil refinery. It's one of the largest in the world. One would never have even conceived that we will see that refinery, but because there was intent and willingness, both politically and from a business perspective. Many African countries now are asking for oil supply from Nigeria, given the Middle East issues now, which means where there's intent and willingness, things can be done. Now, what am I getting up to? If we set up ourselves to say we want to be a data hub in Africa, we also have to say we need sufficient electricity to be able to power those data centers. We then have to plan and be deliberate about building that capacity that is going to power those data centers. I always say South Africa has no shortage of money. It's always about willingness and the right environment for private sector to operate without a lot of burden, in a way that is, that can improve the general performance of the economy. So if we plan and we invest in the energy generation, we are able to do that. It's a matter of willingness, not a matter of whether we are able to do it or not. The private sector in some countries build their own energy. So that's one of the things that you might see. Those companies that want to build data centers, they might also build their own, mini generation, electricity generation to power those data centers. which is not something that would want ideally. You want the generation to be in the national grid and not necessarily isolated to individual players.
But I reflect, I've been watching the likes of the Mhlanga Commission and the ad hoc committee of Parliament, and I listen to everything that's been going on, and I sometimes struggle to know what's true, what's not true, who's telling the truth, who isn't telling the truth, and so on. But what I do learn from that is that it's complex. There's many different things going on behind the scenes. And I think back to when I was running a business, how complex that can be and the decisions you can make. Now, if you take that to another level of government, and then you've got your provinces and you've got your municipalities and you've got all of these different levels, the points you made about intent and willingness, and if you get behind it, it will happen. I agree completely with that. But given all of that, call it bureaucracy, right? And given some of the corruption that is embedded within places, how do we get beyond that? How do we actually get execution all the way through? And I think back to whatever happened to the Lanseria smart city, or whatever it was that was spoken about, I don't know how long ago, but I remember because I lived out that way. So I was like, yeah, my property price will go up. Never happened. So
yeah, maybe it's still coming. I'm hopeful, but India, businesses thrive in spite of government, which means they don't wait for government to provide solutions. They innovate around whatever the constraints that government has. I think we need to get to such a space as well in our own country, where we realize the constraint that we have and say this is the constraint that we have, and we don't have the ability to remove it, at least from a private sector perspective, because you are now venturing into the political space. How do we work around it? What we have seen in the decade to 2019 was business that would sit back and say, as long as it's not hitting my bottom line, I'm not getting involved. But it quickly became clear that that was not a sustainable strategy, because ultimately, when the whole economy is not performing, it's going to hit every other business. So business needed to change tact and say, we actually need to get involved. Persuade government to change some of the regulations, which we saw in energy. We are seeing it in other sectors. So my approach would be to say, business can be better organized. Business can do that which it can without government in some spaces. And those that it can do, it must continue and just innovate around those constraints. Because if we say we are waiting for all the conditions to be perfect, those conditions will never be perfect. And we're going to sit back and not do anything. As an example, with the issues of data centers, we can say there might not be sufficient electricity, but if there are businesses that really want to drive that sector to the benefit of the country, but also the broader continent, which still needs a lot of capability from an AI perspective, then the solution of building on generation for data centers becomes a viable one. We see mining companies, some have built their own energy to supply themselves. The same thing they do with water. They invest in water infrastructure for their own supply. Some of them are even supplying communities with the extra water they have. So that's business innovating around the capability or the lack of capability that's coming out of government sector.
It makes me think of the government, or the lawmakers have opened up the allowances for investment in infrastructure and private equity for pension funds.
Yes.
Yet pension funds haven't really taken that up to this point for a range of different reasons, and looking towards government to sort of be the catalyst for it all, which you said earlier, R1 trillion being allocated to infrastructure and so on. But I've been a proponent of saying, guys, pension funds in a market or an economy like ours is a significant part of the savings pool, and that capital is needed in order to develop our economy so that the members that we're catering for can retire into an environment that's conducive, not just with the amount of cash, but actually an environment that's conducive to living comfortably in. it talks to the point you're making. You've got to get beyond some of the boundaries of the waiting and looking to see who's going to go first, because pension funds are actually holding a key right now to massive fixed investment in South Africa, and it's just a self-perpetuating wheel. You talk about negative momentum. That's positive momentum that builds. So if the investment happens, and it happens through the right structures with the right input and right governance and so on, it will drive returns, it will drive new opportunities, it will create jobs, that will drive consumer expenditure, it will drive higher tax bills. So that's the faith that I suppose we need to have, but it's a bit of a tough one to get going on. So your thoughts on that, and then also if you can comment for me, the R1 trillion that government is putting aside for infrastructure, is that coming from borrowing? Because our borrowing interest levels are getting quite concerning.
So on the first one, with regard to the long-term nature of pension funds and investment in infrastructure, that we haven't seen as much as we would have expected or what is desired to underpin economic growth, I think it's an important aspect that you bring. It also ventures into this sustainability, ESG sort of realm, where yes, you can retire with a lot of money in a bank account, but if you live in an unsecure, unsafe environment, you're still not better off. So you need the environment to be better. Yes, you can retire with a lot of money, you can buy a Porsche, but if you can't drive it because there are potholes, then it means you can't actually enjoy that retirement. So it actually needs the environment to be just as good as your bank account at the end of your your working career. So it's a valid point. I would venture to go back to early 90s. You would know there are few companies that understood the risks, but they still said, we are transitioning into a multi-party democracy that is underpinned by a constitution that has been negotiated across different parties. It's not perfect, but it's a positive trajectory. And they took a long-term view. Some companies left the country, they delisted, left the country. A few that remained. I'm sure if you go to your bathroom now, you see their name. If you go to the airport, you see their name. Pretty much across logistics, there are industrial complexes in the country. I'm not going to name the name, but I'm sure you will figure out which companies are those. They took a very long-term view on the country, understanding the risks, but some of the opportunities were just obvious in terms of the potential return over the long term. I think that's where we need to be in. Where government have eventually opened up and said, we can't run this sector alone, we're opening up to the private sector, you tend to see massive success and better returns over the long term. Healthcare was opened up. There are a few companies that have done well in the healthcare industry. Education space was opened up. You can see private education providers that have done well. The telcos space was opened up. We only had telecom historically. Now we have a couple of them that have been quite successful because government actually opened up. We have seen that now in energy. It has been opened up. And I would bet my money, energy company, private energy players are going to be some of the good investments going forward, because this is a market that government have actually opened up to private players. The same with logistics and water sector. So my point here is where government have actually opened up to the private sector, they have also loosened the regulatory environment such that it's easier to operate. Once that happens, you tend to see a private sector that comes in performing relatively well with good returns for whoever that invest in such investments. So that's how perhaps pension funds need and retirement funds need to think about, to say, where can we harness these long-term returns without unnecessary burdensome regulatory environment? So it's looking into those spaces where government has actually opened up. That's just one. But there are other trends that we can also see that are necessary for economies to continue to operate, such that it's almost impossible to see how an economy is going to grow without them. Those are some of the sectors where pension funds can say, let's take a long-term look and a long-term perspective and invest in these. Think about healthcare, for instance. We still have a lot of disease burden in Africa. We have a growing population, 2.5 billion by 2050. There's going to be need for healthcare providers across the continent. It's an obvious one. Once you get an increase in in income over time, people should be able to afford. Think about agriculture. We would need to feed this growing population. And if you look at the ability and the arable land that is available globally, 30% is in Africa. So that's another sector where one can see there's need for food, and therefore someone has to produce it. And typically, if you're a business, you do it at a profit. So there is potential for good returns there. No, those are just two sectors, but we can even think about basic infrastructure, about let's say logistics across the continent. If you think about the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, it's not going to succeed unless you link countries by a rapid rail, safe and roads. You need that infrastructure to connect, because until people and goods can move, it's not going to succeed. So that is one other sector that we can actually look at.
Yeah, I mean, your point is 100% in the sense that Africa has the most incredible opportunity given where we are, call it, in the phase of development. There's so much that needs to be done, can be done. There's the workforce that is there. There is capital there and interest from all over the place, but it's in the execution and the will that we're currently not getting it ultimately right. That's the big challenge. And I was just reflecting when you were talking about the private sector. So you take something like security. So if you have the means, you live in a walled estate and you've got security guards around you. If you really have the means, you got guys following you in cars and looking after you and stuff like that. The same applies in terms of health. I mean, if you go to a private hospital versus a public hospital, isn't that just exacerbating, though, the inequality? I mean, the inequality is the inequality. We live with that, okay, and we need to address that. But it's making it really evident. And is that not affecting, ultimately, the political scenario where people are starting to say, hang on a second here. Some people are managing to, what's the right word, get around it, where the rest of us don't have the means to do that.
Look, I think it's an important point, a valid point that you make, given our spatial planning that we have. You would find that in most cases, people are happy to pay for a service. They can do, whatever it takes to pay for a service that is a good service. So if you think about healthcare, the example that you put, there could be low-cost healthcare that provides basic primary healthcare that is made available to low-income households. You see other providers that are playing in that space. And so it's a matter of, you can stagger in terms of the service that you are providing, but not necessarily exclusive to one segment of society. But there are certain services that are non-excludable. If, say, I'm sitting here in Sandton, each business have 3 or 4 security guards around their own property, the whole of Sandton eventually becomes secure because there's security around. So anybody that comes into Sandton to shop, they are also secure because there's a lot of security that is provided by the private sector. In that environment, we don't need the police to be there. The police can then be deployed in other areas where society needs that, and there is not the prevalence of business in that space. So it actually relieves some of the resources that government deploys, and those resources can be redeployed in other areas that need it the most. So this is just an example of how some of this thing can flow into lower income areas.
But I also think the private sector, and maybe I'm a little bit too romantic with this, but the private sector should be innovating, taking into account the broader population and where the demand will ultimately come from, with some faith that hopefully with economic growth coming through, the means will be there for them to afford, albeit lower margin type business. It's like the airlines. At some point in time, they had to pivot. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive. There will be massive opportunity, provided we do get growth going, jobs being created. There's going to be huge demand on that side. But we can't have it just for the haves only. It has to go deeper than that. So the fixed investment we know is needed. Part of fixed investment is confidence locally, private sector come into the fore, pension funds where the savings are, and so on. Those are things that we can all influence in our own rights where we work currently. When it comes to international relations, so right now there's a lot of talk around the international relations, specifically South Africa's relationship with Iran and with Russia and so on. What is your take on the relations with the US? Because I see the US as, I mean, I don't like everything that they're doing, but they are sitting on a wealth of money, and they are hungry to invest and to increase their control exposure, whatever you want to call it. They could bring significant long-term fixed investment to South Africa. That's my view on that. Yet we don't seem to be getting to a point of resolution with them or happiness with them. So what is your take on that?
Look, obviously, it's not at a point that is most ideal, the relationship, and we can see that it's strained. It could improve, and I think what would work for South Africa's favor is to have the ability to attract capital inflows from the US. It is to ease, the tensions. But we also have to recognize the change in the global geopolitical environment, and then look at who is positioned or who has the willingness to partner with South Africa to drive investment without having to. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is look at economic interest. India does it well. They put their economic interest ahead. They can trade, they can get investment from different countries that might even sit on opposite spectrum ideologically. I would think that will be the approach that we would need to do. But also, given the disruption in the trade that we have seen, it also says to us, we need to diversify our trading partners and not rely only on one, because if relationships are strained, then we put our own economy at risk. So diversifying our trade relation would make a lot of sense in the current fragmented geopolitical environment. There is a relationship at a political level, government to government, and then there is a relationship at a business level, business to business. Those sometimes can differ. We have about 600 US companies that are operating in South Africa, despite this strife that's taking place. So my point here is, at a private sector level, there's still an opportunity to deepen relationship and continue to do business with the US businesses. There's nothing that stops domestic players to the extent that the political environment still allows for that. And so these two don't have to always be linked all the time. They can sometimes be de-linked.
Isaah, I could sit here and talk to you all day, but I'm sure you've got other things to do. I mean, what I'm hearing from you, and it's been a clear theme through what you're saying, is that at the end of the day, we can point fingers at governments, but the reality is there's been challenges, if I could be kind, within the government ranks, and momentum is a difficult ball to stop. I was once taught in business that you must just stop it, and that's all good and well. But how exactly do you do that? But the reality is, hopefully, there's the will from a government perspective to try to stop that, and maybe that is in prosecutions taking place or whatever it might ultimately be. But regardless of all of that, and this is the key theme that I'm hearing from you, let's stop moaning about it and let's get off our you-know-what. And as the private sector gets stuck in and compensate in whatever way we can, not because we are charitable in our nature, but because there's actually opportunities there for earnings growth across the board. And that relates to both domestically, but then also in terms of attracting international capital as well to South Africa, because at the end of the day, the investment opportunities are massive right across this continent. It's who's willing and able and I suppose clever enough to exploit that.
Absolutely. I would say, it is in the private sector's vested interest to make sure that we create jobs across the economy so that more people can become customers of our businesses. Me and you, we can buy 2 properties, 2 cars. Who is going to buy the rest that are being produced by different companies? So we need a broader, ability to purchase the services and goods that are being produced. So, transformation is not, something that is just to the benefit of the people that get included in the economy. It is to the benefit of the companies that are operating in the domestic economy. So that's why we actually need to care a lot more about it, which is why, for many companies that have taken the liberty to say, let's invest in education, either giving scholarship, bursaries, learnerships for young people that might not have the opportunity. Over time, that actually broadens the customer base for their own services. It's the right type of investment that is long lasting and it changes the country forever. So we have to think beyond the short term and make the right investments. Even if it seems short term, it might not yield results.
But again, we've got to look at that because I agree completely. I'm a big supporter of transformation, but it's got to be broad-based because you
Absolutely.
need to invite everyone into the economy. The more we invite everyone into the economy, the better the environment will be for us all. That's the reality. It doesn't help just to take from there and put over there and don't grow the pie. And we've got to find ways of growing the pie.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Economic growth must be the fundamental thing that we do because out of growth, we get employment.
Yeah, spot on. Isaah, on that note, it's an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining me on Power Plays and Paydays. We wish you all the best in your endeavors on the what's it called? The Presidential Economic Advisory Council. I'm delighted that you're there because I know there'll be sage advice coming from your perspective, and we look forward to engaging with you hopefully again sometime.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the discussion, Leon.
Okay, all the best. Chat later.